Hi guys, welcome to the Classes Corner. I'm Kat and today I'm going to be talking about the 2006 film 300. Now I'm not in my corner today and I'm actually going to be talking about 300 because of the recommendation of a friend of mine. I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about, so he suggested 300 and here we are. Because it's just a really interesting film to talk about as a classical, ancient history type entity. Now I have two major sort of opinions on this film. My opinions on 300 can be separated into two bits, which is a very personal one in that I don't particularly like this film for a couple of reasons, and those reasons are mainly sort of I'm not that fond of the creative team, both of the graphic novel that the film is based on, 300 by Frank Miller, because I'm not that fond of Frank Miller's work. There's a lot of aspects of his work which make me quite uncomfortable, especially his depictions of women in his work. He tends to depict women as either the whore-virgin dichotomy. He also tends to depict women being abused quite a lot in his work, which I don't particularly like. He also he's not particularly subtle about depicting Muslims or Middle Eastern people in a certain way, and that can be seen in quite a negative way, which can be seen in 300, you know, in the depiction of the Persians, and in other graphic work of his such as The Holy Terror, and it doesn't sit well with me. I really don't like that aspect of his work, so I'm just not the biggest fan of him as creator. Also, I'm not the biggest fan of Zack Snyder as a creator either. Again, his depictions of women in his work tend to make me quite uncomfortable. I know a lot of his work is adaptation of other things, but still. And also he's made some statements in interviews in the past which I feel are quite homophobic, such as his an interview where he was talking about his depiction of Xerxes, as he put a bit of gay coding into the character because he felt that nothing would scare 20-year-old men more than a giant god man who wanted to have his way with them. So, not the biggest fan of Zack Snyder. I also am not the biggest fan of the creative, stylistic aspects of the film. I'm not fond of the filter that Zack Snyder puts on a lot of his work, which either makes the image, his films, look either quite brown or quite grey. Not a fan of that filter, that camera filter he does in post-production. And I'm also not a big fan of the fast, slow, mega fight scenes, that 300 sort of pioneered and then sort of popularised. So it's not my favourite film to watch, but it is interesting academically. It's a very interesting academic film, which leads me to my second point about it, which is that classically it's very, very solid. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. What I mean by that is that it's quite an interesting depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae, in which the 300 Spartans fought, and a concept called the Spartan Mirage. Now, before I get into that, I'm actually going to talk about a bit of the history of Thermopylae and the 300, because it's actually a very important part of Greek culture and about the image of the Spartans. Now, the Battle of Thermopylae happened during the second Persian invasion of Greece, during conflicts called the Greco-Persian Wars. The Battle of Thermopylae happened in 480 BC, and it was actually part of a two-pronged attack that the Persians were involved in. They tried to go over land through entering Greece through an aspect called Thermopylae, which is called the Hot Gates. It's quite a narrow pass, and then a naval attack, which led to a battle called the Battle of Artemisium, which was mainly handled by the Athenians, and I think that's the subject of the film 300 Rise of an Empire, the sequel to 300, that I haven't actually seen and I don't particularly care to see, but I know I'll have to see at some point because of this channel. Anyway, different discussion of that. And our main source, ancient Greek historiographical source about the Greco-Persian Wars and the Battle of Thermopylae is actually in Herodotus's histories, the Histories by Herodotus, where he depicts, after the fact, he historiographically refers to the Greco-Persian Wars and the Battle of Thermopylae. And Herodotus is a great ancient source that modern historians should take with a pinch of salt. He's not what most modern what people might think of as historian. It is actually the first histories, but back then, when he was writing, history meant a very different thing. And I'm actually going to put on the screen somewhere the actual passage where he depicts the Battle of Thermopylae. And I think a lot of people would be surprised as to actually how close to Herodotus's depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae 300 actually is. Because I think a lot of people think it as a sort of a silly action film, and it is a silly action film for the most part, but in terms of its depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae, it is very much like Herodotus. Some things are not quite there. For example, that Herodotus did actually remember the 700 Thespians and the 400 Thebans that joined the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, which some people and the film tend to ignore, but they were there too. Also, the film kind of glosses over the other Greek aspects of the Battle of Thermopylae and the Persian invasion, in that the Greco-Persian Wars were actually a very pan-Hellenic military effort against the Persian invasion. Greek policies never particularly got along for the most part, but the Greco-Persian Wars really did bring a lot of Greece together, so it really was a pan-Hellenic effort, while 300 mainly depicts the efforts of the Spartans as a particular group. So there's a lot of that in there as well. So that kind of, also there's some lines, you know, which the particularly groan-worthy things like, oh, we're not like those Athenian boy lovers, when pederasty was actually really more common in Sparta than it was in Athens, but let's ignore that. And that's, again, Zack Snyder's issues. My issues with Zack Snyder coming into a bit there, but let's ignore that. But yeah, it's actually quite a good depiction. And I think if you read Herodotus and then read 300, a lot of the images, a lot of the iconic imagery really does start to come through, such as sort of the idea of the wall of arrows coming across that makes the sky dark, the presence of the Spartans, there, the presence of the Persians, which the Persian representation is really not accurate to Herodotus. That's a different thing. The depictions of the Persians, while Greece certainly did like to depict the Persians as the 100% villains, they in pottery, in plays, in other aspects, the Persians were not depicted fondly in Greece for a very long time in Greece after the Greco-Persian Wars. So that comes into a different aspect, which I'm going to talk about now, which is, even though 300, again, it's accurate to Herodotus, somewhat. Again, some aspects not, but it's actually quite classically accurate to the text. But what makes 300 particularly interesting is the concept of the Spartan Mirage. Now, the Spartan Mirage is an academic concept, which is the idea that you had the Spartans, who were the real ancient Greek people who lived in the Peloponnese, who were potentially a bit atypical for the standard Greek polis at around 480 BC, let's just say, setting it in the time where the Battle of Thermopylae took place. In that they were atypical in the fact that they had a standing army, which was unusual for Greece at the time, because most Greek policies, were city-states, would go to war every year, but they would just sort of draft in their citizens in summer. You know, they had a war season. But Sparta was unusual because it had this standing army, which it could have because it had this sort of thrall polis sort of next door who did all their farming for them. So they didn't have to have the standard farmers, so most of their citizens could go on to be in this standing army. It was also unusual because it didn't have a city wall. It did once upon a time. Sparta was actually once quite a common polis. I'll put the dates where it changed a bit there, and then it took down its walls and made statements like, Sparta's citizens are men are her walls. you know, so which was unusual because most Greek cities, again, there was a lot of siege warfare going around in this period, so most Greek cities had walls. Sparta was unusual because it didn't. And there are some of these atypical aspects of Sparta as a city-state, and Spartan policies and Spartan militarization were somewhat unusual compared to their neighbours. But the image of the Spartan, and as Sparta as this raw, masculine, militaristic, almost supernatural fighting force, is actually somewhat of a fallacy, because we do have evidence that Sparta didn't go to war any more than any other city-state, and it didn't win any battles or war more than any other city-state, despite being this militaristic force, despite having this standing army and having this reputation. Because that's the part of Sparta which really carried on, it's its reputation. Sparta liked to cultivate the image of itself as this army, as this militaristic force, as this fierce force. But the reality of it didn't really fit, and there comes the Spartan Mirage, which is, as Sparta tried to create this reputation which would stop people fighting them in the first place because they didn't want to fight with Sparta, meaning they didn't actually fight that much, is that idea carried on. You can see it in Herodotus, you can see people talking about Sparta, stories of, say, a Spartan mother telling her son if he goes to war, he must come home with his shield or on his shield, or not come home at all, which means win or die, don't come back a coward. So stories like that really built up this reputation, and then the image of the 300 Spartans standing there alone, again ignoring the 700 Thespians and the 400 Thebans, but not the point, in that actually that is the point, because there seems to have been an effort by the Spartans, or by people who wanted to build up the Spartan thing as a Spartan stand. It's actually a really important part of Spartan culture now. Even in the modern city of Sparta, you have 300 Street, you have Thermopylae Street, you have Leonidas Street, you have statues to Leonidas everywhere. So this image of the 300 Spartans is so ingrained in that culture as this ultimate fierce force. So, and that ties into the Spartan Mirage, as the Spartans as this big thing. And 300 very much ties into that. And it's not a new concept. Again, Herodotus kind of started it in his depiction of the Spartans. Other ancient writers built into it. Spartan reputation got more and more fierce. So the Romans loved the idea of Sparta as this raw thing. It actually became a bit of a Roman tourist area around the 2nd century AD. Like, you have writers like Pausanias talking about Romans going to Sparta and being like, oh my god, this is Sparta, you know. So it's not a new concept, but 300 really ties into it. And I know actually people going into university now, who were going to university when I was going into university, being like, oh my god, Sparta, like we're gonna study Sparta, and Sparta was Sparta, you know, this thing, and then getting a rude awakening around there in 1st or 2nd year of university. It was like, oh no, actually the Spartans weren't like that actually at all. And 300 plays to it from a very visceral level, because you have these big action hero men, and then you have what makes me laugh in that film a lot is actually the depiction of Sparta as a physical location in the world, as the physical aspects of Sparta as this sort of rough, barren, dusty area with the giant pit, which is that I've actually been to Sparta. I've been to Sparta with my university, again seeing the 300 streets and all that, and Sparta smells like fruit trees. It's a beautiful area of Greece. It's lush, it's very fertile, it's really just a really beautiful, I'll put a picture up somewhere, and it's a really pretty area. So the idea of these strong, hardy people came from a barren, hardy place is complete rubbish. And it wouldn't have changed. It would still have been a beautiful area back then. So it's just this image that's built up. And the idea that Spartans would throw babies over cliffs if they weren't perfect Spartan material. Again, I've studied child exposure and child abandonment, and statistically, like, it's unlikely it would have been like that, and it does play into this image of the Spartans in this certain way, which actually doesn't really work. But why it's interesting in the film is because the film is somewhat aware of this, in that the depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae and the 300, the iconic 300, and Leonidas as this king, which actually Sparta had 2 kings, it was actually a diarchy, which is again another aspect of why it was a bit atypical. 2 royal families. Is that it's actually, the Battle of Thermopylae is being told by an old man in the film. It's a secondary narrative. So it's a person creating this image of what Sparta is like from a Spartan, which makes sense because the Spartans wanted to create, back in ancient Greece, wanted to create this image. So it very much plays into. And again, I know people who really still buy into the Spartan Mirage. And if you want to study Sparta academically, long term, it's a great thing to do. Sparta is interesting, it has a lot of history, it's, you know, if you want to study something that's not Athens, Sparta is a little bit easier to study. Classics can be very Athens-centric, which sometimes isn't the best. And Sparta is an interesting choice to do, but don't go into studying Sparta being like, oh yes, the Spartans, like, what a masculine thing, they were so cool and so battly, and when they weren't really. And don't get me wrong, I literally know, when we left Sparta with the uni, I literally know a guy who loves Sparta so much, he literally cried because we were leaving Sparta. I mean, it might have also been because he was horrifically hungover, but still. But yeah, that's the sort of idea of the Spartan Mirage, and classically academic. If you're interested in the Greco-Roman Wars and Sparta, read Herodotus, really fascinating text. Again, take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, but take every ancient source with a bit of a pinch of salt. Also, quick thing, one thing that does tickle me about the film is people are like, oh, why did Gerard Butler have a Scottish accent? Because he's Scottish, but why did they keep that? And actually, that makes me laugh, because it's a translation pun that they kept in the film, which from a classicist point of view makes me giggle, because in ancient Greek, the Spartans came from a part of Greece where it had the Doric dialect of ancient Greece, and Scottish also has something called the Doric dialect. So when people were back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, when people were translating Greek texts, and if you had a Spartan drama specifically, and if you had a Spartan character, their dialogue was always translated into a Scottish accent. So there's that, which 300 did. So even though I don't particularly like the film, I can give it quite a lot of credit. So yeah, if you guys like the film, you know, tell me why. If you guys want to talk about more about Spartans, pop it down in the comments below. If you like this video, please like, share and subscribe, and I will be here next week talking about more classics. If you have any opinions on what you want me to talk about, pop it below as well, and I will see you then. Okay, bye guys.